Well, then we are back with more understandings from the renewed covenant. This is from the Aramaic English translation of the word. And regarding the 1 Corinthians, also from the previous video, it states simply regarding then the functions of Ruach HaKodesh. As we understand, he was then explaining and delegating the main responsibilities to his countrymen, the set apart, while then making mention of a very tiny portion of it regarding the Gentiles. But then he states, very interestingly, on the 6th verse of the 7th chapter, "But these myself say to you as to weak persons, not of positive precept. For myself desire that every male might be like myself in purity." But then obviously Shaul had a very high standards ever since he was a boy. It was his wish for the males to be like him because he was imitating the Messiah. But there is no way in the world a person would ever be able to imitate Shaul while having then the proper perspective from the Hebraic style of living, obviously. And then he states further, "But every male then is endowed with his function." It's not gift. Gift is wrong. It's a function. So then he's speaking of then the set apart, the elect. But every male is endowed with his function. What is he saying? He is then giving specific instructions only to the set apart. And then he continues stating the function of Elohim. Obviously, 7 spirits of Elohim, 7 functions. Then one does and another so. What he's saying, a person has a function of prophecy, the other has a function of a healing. So he's saying then, let every male be then involved with his function. So his desire was then for his set apart people to be like himself, not having a wife. This was his desire. Because what was the reason behind? It's because then the males can then spend 100% of their time in teaching and instructing the people without being distracted regarding relationships. He's not saying relationship is bad. He's simply stating that his desire, because he prefers every male functioned in Ruach HaKodesh to remain single. But then later he stated, because of sexual temptation, let then each male have his wife. He doesn't discard the fact of not having function after having relationship. That's not the point. But Shaul prefers then the males to become single yet functioning. So he's not stating a preference over each other in terms of what is holy or what not holy. He's simply saying it is the best for the male then not having a wife, but then function properly. He does not condemn having a relationship. That's not the point. The understanding is he is giving these understanding to the set apart. So then later then he explains why. Because of a sexual problem, let each male have his wife. But then he's speaking of as a set apart Hebrew person, not a Gentile person. He's giving specific instructions only to the set apart. Because as we understand, Gentiles, they have no function. They don't have any gifting. Doesn't exist. What does exist are the functions. So then Shaul then later he explains, and he's stating then, but if the unbeliever separates, let him separate, and a brother or sister is not to be in bondage in such cases. Then he explains of the family, what it means and what not, and every time he then states a situation regarding the family, he always places them in both layers. First the layer of the previous covenant, and then the second. So then always when we read, we begin to understand what it meant. But the most important is understanding of the set apart. The Gentiles are to copy by the example, but they are not bound of doing the way they do it. It might sound a bit confusing, but it is regarding the layers. If we have dual-layered understanding this factor, then the understanding comes. If you have only a single layer, then it does not make any sense. Taking dual layer, first the previous covenant. The previous covenant, what comes to your mind? The camp set by Moshe in the desert. Then he compares with then the relationship before the anointing, because he speaks of functions. Functions are related with the power from Elohim. So then when he states regarding the family, he is obviously stating the second service and the anointing. Because then he states, if then a believing wife or husband then is in a relationship with the unbelieving, what does he mean? When he was then explaining and instructing the people, some of them were then in a relationship and then they were saved. While he was then delineating, for instance, if there was a set-apart elect in a relationship with a Gentile, not part of the elect, then he would delineate those areas. He was not saying that they should divorce. He is simply delineating because they were involved with the function. There were then couples and relationships that were being functioning. However, there was then a Gentile mixed in the midst of it, and Gentiles could not perform a function. However, the believing person was then either, when a lady was set apart, though she did not function, she was then to remain patiently being with her people, obviously outside of the camp, because when the husband is not then set apart and not invited in a camp, they can't go in a camp. So they remain outside, but she then encourages her husband. So it is a bit complicated from the viewpoint of Shaul, because he had a lot of areas to cover. So then when the people were coming to the faith, there were people then coming from the elect or from the set apart. There were people coming from pagan. There were people coming from Gentiles. In each of those wanting to have some sort of a function, and then Shaul had to put a line in it. Transitional time. So then he is then explaining, for the husband who does not believe is sanctified by the wife that believes. He's not speaking of function anymore. He's simply speaking of the fact that then when the wife is then the elect and in a relationship with an unbeliever, she then becomes the leader, in quote. Because sanctification has to do with the presence of the Mashiach. So then it continues then, and the wife who does not believe is sanctified by the husband, obviously. And then otherwise their children would be impure. But they are not. They are pure because of the fact of the wife. As long as the husband does not get involved in paganism and trying to push paganism upon, and then, but if the unbeliever separates, let him separate. Let's say, for instance, what he's saying is, in a relationship where then a spouse becomes a believer and then the other does not want, then he say, let them separate them, because the most important is the Mashiach. Either the person that does not have the Mashiach come to the faith, or then let them separate. That's what he's saying. But if the unbeliever separates, let him separate. Because he is emphasizing the importance of the Mashiach in their lives. What he's saying previously is, when there is a spouse, an unbeliever spouse, you have to endure until the spouse comes to the faith. But then if the spouse can't take it, then separate. Then a brother or sister is not in bondage of such cases, because he's speaking of the Gentiles mostly, because the set apart are already from the anointing and of the set apart line. There is a whole lot more understanding that comes from these areas, because the situation is quite clear. At the same time, must have layers of understanding every time. As you would eat in the morning breakfast in a set of pancakes at the same time. You can't eat them each by each. You have to take them sometimes 4 or 5 and then bite them together. This is what it means, understanding the scriptures from the Hebraic Aramaic understanding. If you try to understand it from the Greco-Roman, it is always a twisted, junky outline that comes out of it. Not saying that this is bad regarding the people that are bad, because they did not know. Some of the areas they did know. Some of them they scoundrelized in purpose. For instance, the story of Cornelius was lied in purpose. The situation regarding Yohanan on the island, it was lied in purpose. Some of these areas of relationship, they did not have a clue. They translated simply from the best of their ability. However, lacks the layers. That's why it's so confusing. From the regular standard translation, you can't make sense out of it. And what comes out of it is crazy. That's why there are so many denominations that they don't get along, because there are thousands upon thousands of translations and then interpretations. However, when you understand it from the Hebraic or Aramaic understanding, then nicely comes in layers. Then you can't lie. Simply you can't, because every time you face then the renewed covenant, you understand it from the previous. When you think of the renewed covenant, you must understand, there is the previous covenant to back it up. So then you begin to understand in layers. You are reading a portion of the renewed covenant, it's a layer. What is the previous? It's another layer, and those must harmonize. Otherwise, you can't make an understanding out of it, because it lacks. In any portion that you read the renewed covenant, you will find the other layer from the previous. So then what Shaul is saying is, if there is a relationship where a spouse then is unbeliever, and then the other spouse is a believer, he is not saying to be together. He is only simply stating for the saved spouse to be enduring, and then bring the other spouse to the faith. If the spouse can't take it, let them separate. That's precisely what he's saying. But if the unbeliever separates, let him separate. A brother or sister is not bound in such cases. Some people say, oh, because God does not like divorce, but He's not speaking of set apart. When relating with areas of the Gentiles, Elohim, or the true Creator, He wants His set apart elect, and those He does not want them to be separated. He does not want them to divorce. However, Gentiles are not the same level. They come to the faith. If a spouse comes and the other doesn't, at some point, if the other spouse does not want to get fed up with it, then separate. There is no if, whats, or buts, or any kind of a religion mixed with it, because Shaul then he gives precise and direct guideline. For if the unbeliever separates, let him separate. A brother or sister is not in bondage in such case. What does he mean? He was comparing with the previous covenant. Bondage in a word of the Hebraic understanding, it is then the law. It is the law of Moses that came from Elohim. It's a bound, but the word bound does not have a negative tone to it. It is a positive tone. However, bondage, for many people, they are thinking of being bound by a law. But it's negative when truly it's not negative. It is related with a link from the previous covenant, holy and proper. But then what he's saying is there is no link regarding the Gentiles then, or the unbeliever, when he himself or herself wants to separate from the faith. And we Gentiles, we can't encourage saying, oh, God does not want divorce. Don't be involved in it. Because Shaul gave guidelines, don't be involved with it other than encouraging the believing spouse to endure and bring the other spouse to the faith. But when it comes to a point where you can't take it anymore, then separate. That's what he's saying. Because what is the most important in the life of the believing spouse? Is it the furthering of the faith in the Messiah, or is wasting the time with a dead weight? Shaul is encouraging to remain in a relationship. However, when the unbeliever then decides to separate, separate. Because Shaul is given then priority to the anointing based and coming from the believer. However, when we turn this understanding to the set apart, then they should never separate. Because then they themselves, they are then linked with the previous covenant and involved with the power from heaven. Then they should never separate. So it makes a whole lot more practical relationships out there, because a person can't be for 10, 20 years living in a relationship and then with the spouse always scoundreling around. Doesn't want to learn the faith, does not want to have any relationship with the Messiah. What about the other spouse? Is going to live in this junky relationship for the rest of life? Of course not. Either shape up or then terminate the relationship. because then either of them are not bound by any kind of responsibility other than for a time to endure until the other spouse comes to the faith. Obviously, he has the understanding from the unbeliever. When the unbelieving spouse then is fed up with it, let it separate. He's not taking the initiative from the believing spouse. The believing spouse must be always patiently waiting. However, we can understand there is a limit. When the unbelieving spouse becomes to put blocks in front of the believing person, making it, in quote, hard for the person to exercise the faith, trying to make a mockery out of it, and there is a patience limit. What Shaul is stating then, if the unbeliever then becomes to have this kind of lifestyle against the Mashiach, obviously should separate. Because the person is not bound by the previous covenant. However, from the understanding that Shaul is given, he is encouraging to the believing husband or wife to endure. However, the endurance he is speaking of, as long as the believing spouse has the liberty of exercising the faith, and then the unbelieving not having the Torah pushed down the throat. They kind of coexist. Because then when the faith comes to the home, there is a tendency of copying what the set apart do. And the more the faith increases, the more stringent the relationship becomes. Because the sins of the unbeliever or the unbelieving spouse is going to show up very clearly. So the best is for both of them to become believers and then remain in the faith. Then obviously what's going to give you the understanding is you're showing, let's say you're in a relationship, your spouse is not a believer, and you show up to the gates and ask for instructions. Then you receive. Stay a bit longer in the relationship when it comes to a point where you may not stay in a relationship anymore. And then it states very clear, and the woman who has a husband that does not believe and he is disposed, or it's not disposed in terms of disposal. Okay, he's speaking of, he is then making up his mind to live with the wife. Try to understand, the disposed does not mean disposal. It has to do with making up the mind. Or decided, and he is decided and to inhabit with her, let her not forsake her husband. For the husband then who does not believe is then sanctified by the wife that believes, and the wife who does not believe is sanctified by the husband that believes. Otherwise their children would not be pure. It's not the case. But if the unbeliever separates, let him separate. Because the tendency is when the believing spouse is more active in the faith, the relationship becomes then very, very, very rocking, quote. because the anointing and then comes and then requires more of the relationship towards the Messiah, and honestly goes so far, and then the other unbelieving person can't stand anymore. Because when the believing spouse then understands the truth, then there are guidelines that comes as a result of the loyalty to the Messiah and doesn't line up with the unbelieving person. After a short while, a person separates. And that's what Shaul is stating. If the unbeliever separates, let it separate. But then the spouse, prior of this breaking, must do every situation requirable to make sure that this person has a chance of coming to the faith. And a lot of times, relationship maybe would last what? Maybe a year? And no more, otherwise it becomes stupidity. Would then a believing husband or wife be living with an unbeliever for 10, 20 years? Absolutely not. Has no point in it, because the unbelieving person simply becomes a hindrance of the believing spouse. If the relationship doesn't line up in a year's time, it won't do it anymore. So there are limitations. And mostly because he's speaking of unbelievers or Gentiles. He's not speaking of the set apart. The set apart are not divorced, period. There is no more talk regarding relationships when it comes to the set apart. Gentiles, however, he's extending extra understanding and extending the time, making sure then the believing spouse extends a kind and understanding presence of Elohim while they are in a relationship. And then if it doesn't take place in a year, then forget it. The believing spouse must move on. Please stay tuned, much more coming up, because this is a very important topic, because there are so many couples bound by laws and wrong understandings from the word that never came from the Hebraic or Aramaic viewpoint. They are bound by a Greco-Roman twisted understanding from Elohim, and he never gave the order. It's very evident. If a person is not lining up in a year's time, further it's a waste of time. And then, this is what Shaul mentioned. Then, and to the rest I say, not myself saying these, because he was speaking then with the Gentiles, so his tone changes. As to the rest, he's then speaking not the Messiah. Okay? That if a brother who has a wife does not believe, so he is speaking of the Gentiles. So this viewpoint, he doesn't even have the presence of Elohim in it. That's why he says then the rest. And then the rest. After he is done with the conclusions of the set apart and the first layer from the previous covenant, then he comes to the other people, the set apart, not related with it, but then the Gentiles. Then to the rest. These rest can be either the set-apart brother or sister that got involved in a relationship, or can be only Gentiles, or can be a Gentile in a faith with a pagan person. But it means then the rest, and not the Mashiach that gave to him. He's simply saying, based upon what he observed from then the previous covenant. Because Elohim, he does not mix himself with the Gentiles to the point of instructing them of what to do. They did instruct his elected people how they should act and become then examples and shepherds of the Gentiles, and this is what Shaul is doing. He's shepherding the Gentiles. However, because he was then speaking of Gentiles and set apart in a relationship, he had to make a distinction. That's the only reason why he said, was not the Mashiach that spoke these rest, but then himself, because he was shepherding them. So then when he would speak to the set apart involved with the Gentiles in a relationship, both of them would understand. So please stay tuned.